a name that I personally trust. Prof, if you only know how our previous discussions has had a profound effect on me as a person, because people's asking me, okay, 43 years old, that waistline is really down, weighing 65 kilos, and that is because I probably eat rice once a week due to you. so thank you for that. I'm not aging the way I should be aging.
No, you're looking fantastic, I must say. I don't know when we last spoke, but you certainly look slimmer than you did then. And you're looking really healthy, so congratulations.
It's working. The only thing I don't get well with you is I don't go near lots of meat, but it's probably because of whatever reasons. But we'll chat about that again at some point.
Sure.
Prof, the world is changing. Everyone's world has started changing. And I really thought about you in this time because we see individuals, their behavior changing because they're no longer allowed to go out. So when we go out to work or we're able to go to the mall, we're still picking up lots of steps and picking up lots of kilometers. But now people are restricted to their gardens and their homes. That's number one. The complete behavior changes from the perspective of there's a lethargic. I said it to psychologist Sharissa Bloomberg 2 days ago. I said that there's a mental pandemic at the same time where people's psychology is changing. They're becoming more sedentary. Only some people are waking up to say, hey, I can't go on like this at all, just sitting in my room watching television all day, or whatever that might be. So it is pertinent that we discuss where we're at the moment, what those changes could be, and some of your advices to get past some of those challenges.
Fantastic. I'd be very happy to discuss those. I notice in myself it's becoming more difficult to exercise. And fortunately now that we are allowed to exercise, I can run most days. So that's been a big difference. But I noticed with the 5 weeks, the original 5 weeks, I did get more lazy. And that's a real problem. I can see that it's going to change a lot of people's behaviors. And we're going to have to change that in some way. A lot of people actually, I know a lot of people are putting on weight. But some people will lose weight because they will actually stop eating a lot of the nonsense, which we'll come to later on. And they will, because they have to cook for themselves, they'll eat a slightly healthier diets. And that's one of the good things, that people may start to discover how to cook again, and that would be a great change.
Okay, so you're saying, obviously, I never thought about that, and I think that's a crucial point, that people are not actually going into much of the takeouts right now. And I never thought about that, but that's a really crucial point.
Yeah, a lot of people are tweeting that they've actually lost weight during this period. And that's because they're eating less sugary, addictive foods.
Correct.
And so that may well be a change. You know, what's really interesting about this whole epidemic is that it's the first time that governments have said, okay, we're going to take on one disease. And the question is, why did they choose COVID-19 rather than other diseases? There might be other diseases that we would have tackled, which might have been more important. And it'll come back in our discussions, I'm sure, that to me, type 2 diabetes is the disease we really should be taking on. And if we can encourage people to understand that the COVID-19 goes for people with comorbidities, and the key comorbidity is diabetes and what we call insulin resistance. And if people want to protect themselves from this disease, of course you must do everything the government is telling us to do. But ultimately, it's up to each of us to look after our own health. And that means we've got to look at what we're eating and how healthily are we eating. And as you mentioned earlier, your immune system, I'm sure, looking at you now, is going to function very well should you be struck by the COVID virus. But maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, it might have been a slightly different picture.
Professor, you mentioned something very critical, and that is that I understand the aspect of comorbidities, and just for our audience, Professor is effectively saying here that if you got diabetes, then you're standing at a much more tougher junction if you should get the COVID-19 virus. So this effectively means, are you, if I may just ask you a very direct question, are you saying that what we should be doing right now is looking after those issues, because the one thing that we can put under control I mean, the chances of us getting COVID, we can just put our nose out, or we could just get a visitor, or a courier company could just deliver a package to us, and it could contain the virus. But the one thing that you can and you do have in your control right now is, for example, keeping your diabetes under control and keeping away from it.
Yeah, so let's look at the global responses. The one model is the lockdown model. The other is not the lockdown model. That's the Swedish model, where they didn't go into lockdown. And at the moment, we can't really say which is going to work out better. Was full lockdown really important, or wasn't it? What's really interesting, a paper I read this morning showed that people chose to lock down themselves long before the lockdown actually became in action. At least that's in the United States. So people started, as soon as the virus started hitting, they would restrict themselves. They didn't go to work. Long before they were told not to go to work, they realized it's probably better to stay at home. So that's really interesting, that people understand that there are good ways to protect yourselves, and one of them is to keep away from where the virus is. But the Swedish model says that, listen, everyone's going to be infected in due course. It doesn't matter if it happens quickly or long term, it's going to happen. And if that is the case, if the virus is so widespread that we're all going to get it, then the only hope we have is to make sure that we are in the best possible state to deal with the condition. And very early on, it became apparent that the real risk factors for this disease were firstly age. The first studies coming out of Wuhan and out of Italy showed that the average age of the people infected with fatally infected was over 80. So this is a disease of older people, and particularly older people living in communities, in old age homes. That's where it really strikes. So that's the one population that are at risk. Then they began to realize that obesity was the other big factor, high blood pressure, and all the other factors, the metabolic syndrome, the type 2 diabetes, that those put you at greatly increased risk. And that if you're below 50 and you have none of those comorbidities, you don't have diabetes, you don't have hypertension, you're not insulin resistant, your metabolic state is good, the mortality is almost zero. It's unbelievable how this disease really targets older people who have those comorbidities. Now, let's take it a step further. There's good evidence now that if you do have the virus and you are critically ill, the better your glucose control, if you're type 2 diabetic, the better your glucose control, the less the mortality. So the message is, even if you're over 50 and you have diabetes, if you can just start improving your control of your glucose, your risks are going to be reduced. Should you get the infection, you've got to control your glucose as best as possible, because this virus just loves glucose, and it's clearly that helps the virus grow in the body.
Of course, and that was actually my next base question, because I was thinking to myself that when you said that obviously when you have diabetes, then you are in a much worse position. So an audience member sitting out there thinking that they've got diabetes right now, are they doomed at all? And you're saying, no, they're not doomed if they can start today by effecting some changes. And I would perhaps want you just to touch a little bit on that changes, because I think we speak to a lot of diabetics, and even in our previous episodes we did together, we speak to a lot of people, and in that moment they're saying that, okay, can you practically tell me what to do? So let's just take patient A, sitting outside somewhere in Cape Town right now, that some people is calling Wuhan province, by the way. So because we got the highest number. So let's take the Western Cape. Somebody sitting out there, they've got diabetes, they're on their metformin and everything else, but they don't really think about it that much. But now that you've said it, that you could get COVID, and let's say the person is 60 years old and diabetes, practically what should they be doing to reduce that risk?
Okay, so I always get accused that Tim Noakes comes along and says it's the Banting diets is the solution for everything.
I thought that's going to happen.
Okay. So when we wrote the Real Meal Revolution, if you look at it, it does say that. It does say that the treatment for diabetes and for insulin resistance is the Banting diet. Now, that was in 2013. Well, now, fortunately, in 2018, the Virta Health Company in San Francisco has shown, this is the first study in the world to show that if you reduce your carbohydrate intake to less than 25 grams of carbohydrate per day, 60% of people will go into what we call remission. In other words, their blood glucose control is so good that they look like they don't have diabetes. We call it remission because it's not cure. You're never cured of type 2 diabetes. As soon as you go back to eating more carbohydrates, the disease will come back. But the key is that if you can keep your glucose down and your insulin levels down by not eating carbohydrates, the disease is, in a sense, reversed, and you don't then have all the risks associated with the disease. And what the COVID-19 experiment clearly shows is that you can be diabetic, but if you've got normal glucose control, the virus is not going to kill you as likely as it will if you have type 2 diabetes and poor glucose control. So that's a very good reason. So that the problem in my profession is that we've said type 2 diabetes is a complex disease and it's progressive, and it's not true. It's the treatment that's the problem. And that as soon as one realizes that this is a behavioral disease, it's what you eat every day, every meal determines whether you're diabetic or not. And you make that choice. And what Verda Health was so clever at, they realized that you can't reverse type 2 diabetes by seeing the doctor once a month and him giving you medicines, metformin or insulin. That doesn't cure or put the disease into remission. You have to be with the patient 24 hours a day. And what Verda Health did was they set up a telemedicine type control system where you could consult with experts and they would monitor you 2 to 3 times a day until you got your behavior changed. And once you change behavior, then the disease is in remission. So that's the key. People need to understand type 2 diabetes is a disease of behavior. And the key behavior is what you choose to eat with every meal. And as soon as you get your eating under control and eat few carbohydrates, 25 grams a day maximum, which is very little, you're going to put the disease into remission.
It's amazing how, when I started this interview and I was thinking about all of this before we started the show, I was wondering how some of the work that you've been doing over time, and it was going to be one of my questions, but it's almost as we got right into it, because I was going to ask you how some of your life's work that you're known for was actually, does it fit in any way into this? And it is very apparent that it fits directly into the center of it all through the fact that diabetes is a key factor when it comes to the contraction of COVID-19 and how you're going to make it out in the end of the day. So the old saying of sugar gives you energy for this one is purely just not going to fly at all.
No, absolutely. So it's been very rewarding because I got criticized, and all the problems I had arose because I spoke to a group at Parliament. It wasn't parliamentarians. It was the wellness group at Parliament. And then that was reported on the front page of the Cape Times. And my university decided that I'd gone too far. Now I had to be excommunicated, so to speak. And what I said at that meeting, now which was in 2013, I said diabetes is a time bomb and it's going to explode. And now it's exploded. You know, if we didn't have the incidence of diabetes, obesity, and metabolic syndrome in this country or in the world that we now have, this virus wouldn't have had the same impact. So when people are questioning why we're in lockdown because we've been eating so badly for the last 50 years. That's why we're in lockdown. And if only people can get that message, that it's up to us individually to do something about this. I think governments have failed, and this is not the South African government, this is globally, because they're following what everyone else has done. They failed when they took on the idea that a low-fat diet was healthy, without any evidence whatsoever. And that is one of the great scams in medicine of the last 50, 60 years. It was complete. There never was a scrap of evidence to show that we should change our diets. But then industry got behind it. We got all this industrial food, this highly processed food, and we started eating that food, and that was the cause. So looking for the cause of the lockdown is because we changed our diets in 1977, and we started eating this commercialized, industrialized, highly processed foods. And we took out all the healthy real foods, which we're designed to eat, and they would keep us healthy.
And that's all come back to bite us eventually in one form or the other, even through what we see today.
Yeah.
Professor, it's been a difficult time for people. Some people, their psychology is out of kilter at the moment because there are other pressures that are going on. So people are not certain about their jobs. They're not certain about schooling. Some students at university are concerned. So I think of the 7.7 or 8 billion people around the planet, everybody seems to have a particular challenge that concerns them. And at the bottom of all of that, some people might see it or not, but health sits at the bottom of all of that in terms of priority. And it's something that because once that goes, then it doesn't matter what job you have or anything else that you have. Once that is out of order, everything else is out of order in any case. For the average South African family at the moment watching the show, what's your advice to them? What are some of the changes that they could have, knowing that they are isolated? Governments and everybody is enforcing the aspects of masks and all of that, but just as a scientist, your broader advice around some of those issues, so that we can map a way forward and come out perhaps more healthy at the end of all of this, perhaps cleansing process.
Again, I don't want to keep on bashing the same old drum, but we have to look to nutrition. Now, this is a side that people haven't spoken about. But the other real predictor of a bad outcome is vitamin D deficiency. It's astonishing how the people who are dying have very low vitamin D levels, and those who are surviving a serious infection have high levels. And vitamin D deficiency has now been identified as a major risk factor for a fatal COVID outcome.
Vitamin D. I need to ask you this question because there's always a confusion around this one. Vitamin D, is it only acquired through your time in the sun?
That's the best way to get the vitamin D. That's right.
Okay, so winter's coming up, and COVID is in the making, and you're now saying that vitamin D is a big problem. So how do we get around that?
And can I just add, and this is, I don't be racially sensitive about this, but people with slightly darker skin are at much greater risk, and that's been shown in the United Kingdom. Many of the people, the healthcare workers who have died, have in fact been darker skinned, and that's because they have low vitamin D levels, because they're not exposed to the sun, but then a darker skin prevents you from producing as much vitamin D. So those populations need to be even more sensitive to eating more vitamin D. So that's a really important point. So vitamin D you get from your skin, but you also get it from the diet. And vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. So if you're eating a low-fat diet, you're not getting enough vitamin D in. And that vitamin D that you're taking in, you can't absorb properly if you've got a low-fat diet. So these are other factors, and I think that will come out. The fat-soluble vitamins D, E, A, and K, but vitamin D and vitamin A seem to be really important in immune function. And if you don't have enough vitamin D, you get this immune storm. That is the ultimate killer in this disease. So now, as we've gone away from a diet made from real foods, from animal produce, our vitamin D intake has gone down and our vitamin D levels have gone down. And that seems to be another very important factor in fatal outcomes. So, simple advice is everyone should start taking more vitamin D from day one, because that may already help. And there are trials now of giving people vitamin D, and I'm not sure whether they're going to show any benefit or not, but if you have the infection, I would not wait 1 second. I would load up on vitamin D, but I would start now. Where else do you find vitamin D? Well, you find vitamin D in animal produce, particularly dairy produce. So that's very important to start doing that. And then cut sugar. Sugar has got to go from the diet, and that's very difficult because, as we've discussed at length on your show, sugar is present in all processed foods. So basically you need to reduce the amount of processed foods. Now, a lot of people will immediately say, yes, but if you follow Dr. Noakes' diet, it's a very expensive diet, and that's not true. Our foundation promotes the Eat Better South Africa campaign, and we've shown that people can do reasonably well for 30 to 40 Rand a day for an individual eating this diet, because they focus on eggs and milk and pilchards and other tinned fish. And you can eat a healthy, and of course offal. And as soon as you mention offal, people go mad, saying you're trying to get people to eat inferior food. Well, offal, in fact, is superior food.
That's rather interesting.
That we have against it. So those are the foods that we need to start eating. Those are the really healthy foods. I get really upset when I see that people say fruit and vegetables are the health foods. They aren't. It's the animal produce that's the animal. That's the healthy foods that we should be eating.
Anything on the physical side? We know that people are restricted and they are in little corners now which they've never been before. And even if you have a huge property, you still start feeling slightly restricted after a while. Any advice around that side to people? I know that exercise is key, and I know that you've done some work around all of that all the years, but what could people really do at home?
Yeah, that's the problem, because it takes motivation. And if you weren't an exerciser before, you're not going to become an exerciser now. So to me, that's a real problem. I think it's the culture that we have. We've got to encourage exercise from a young age and get the people to find something they really enjoy doing. And you're not going to find it now under these conditions.
No, of course.
So it's all very well done.
Professor, the last 3-4 minutes, I just want to reflect on you as a person. How's things been going at home during the lockdown with you and your wife? How are you finding the change? I know that you've been a fairly active person. I mean, you were someone that used to run ultramarathons and all these kind of things. So obviously you should be feeling like you're in a box at the moment.
Listen, I've got nothing to complain about. I really
Are you enjoying it?
I'm so fortunate that I can. I've got food on the table. I'm a pensioner, so I've got a salary, and my family are protected, and so I couldn't be more protected. So I feel very privileged. So what have I been doing? I do exercise most days. Now I can fortunately run, and that I was doing some sort of pretend gym work, because I go to the CrossFit gyms, and so my coach tells me what I must do every day. So I do that. I continue to do that. He lent me some equipment. I can't do all the stuff that I'd like to do, but that's how I've kept physically active. I've done more gardening in the last 5 weeks than I did in the last year. I think I've been out in the garden for 3 or 4 hours a day, also getting my son. And so I've been doing that, and I've been writing a lot. So I've quite enjoyed it. I must admit, I do miss going to miss going to the restaurants, but otherwise I'm doing very well, and I've got absolutely nothing to complain about.
Didn't you perhaps? This is something that I noticed, and I'm not sure if you're on the same wavelength there, but I perhaps thought that in life, just from a broader philosophical perspective, that we were going a bit too fast at times as human beings, and I think we were too cluttered in what we were doing. We were just moving, but if we stop at times to look at what are we really doing, we were just going at a hell of a pace as human beings. And I've been using the time to actually reflect, and I've been thinking a lot, and it has, only if you stop you can start thinking and start putting things in perspective. And I don't know if that's been happening on your side, where you're just actually using the time positively.
Oh, absolutely. I'm writing another book at the moment. I mean, I'm always going to be writing books, but this is the one looking at the low-fat disaster. And there are two famous books that were written by friends of mine. Gary Taubes wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories, and Nina Teicholz, who was one of my expert witnesses at my trial, she wrote The Big Fat Surprise. And they're two phenomenal books, and they just look at the history of how we got it all wrong on diet, where we went from eating animal produce, and then we went on this low-fat, highly processed food diets, and how that caused all the problems. And they describe the steps, the fake science, but it was so well written, you had to dig into it. And what I've done in a series of about 30 columns that I write for the CrossFit website, the crossfit.org, people are welcome to go and read them. It's crossfit.org and the essentials, and just type in my name and you'll see what I've written. But I didn't start with the idea of writing a book, but as it became apparent that I thought that I've got something, and I'm speaking to Nina Teicholz and asking her, will she be a co-author on this thing? So what I've done is I've identified the 70 events over the last 100 years that got us into this trouble. And I
70.
show how the science was 70.
70.
70.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, that's a bit hectic.
I'll give you a classic one. In the 1950s and the 1960s, there were two theories of what causes heart disease. The one is it's too much carbohydrates, and the other is it's too much fat. And the carbohydrate story was rather edging ahead. There was more evidence for it than the fat one, you see. And on July the 1st, 1965, the Sugar Association in North America sent one of their leading directors to Harvard Medical School with an explicit instruction that he was to get the two senior professors in nutrition at Harvard to write an article which would say that saturated fat is causing heart disease, and sugar and carbohydrates are completely safe. So up to that point, there was a debate between the two. The two were, and as I said, the sugar carbohydrate one was leading. There was more evidence that it was the problem than the fat. They then wrote an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967, and the New England Journal is the premier medical journal in the world. And this said, it's fat that's causing the heart disease, and sugar is fine, and carbohydrate. And from that instant, the story was closed. You could no longer debate it. You could no longer say that carbohydrates were unhealthy. They'd been completely health washed. And so now it became fat. The fat story became dominant. And from there, it was one study after the other, which completely failed to prove it. But because the government had now decided that this was what the problem was, that fat was causing us to get heart disease, fat in our diets, the story was now controlled by governments, and it was impossible to change it. So what I've done is I've just shown those 70 steps. And if you go through them and you come at the end, the final chapter is, okay, let's look at the evidence. This is the evidence against, and it's like this, and this is the evidence for, and it's nothing. But yet, the world continues to think that saturated fat is what's causing heart disease.
That's amazing, and that's just one of it. And I'm trying to think where you got the other 70. I think perhaps during the lockdown you're probably going to come up with another 30. but that's excellent, Professor. That's what I know you for. And thank you for coming onto the show. At some point I'm going to invite you back as things progress, because I have something in mind. And I know that you're one that challenge beliefs, and I know that you're very daring because of what you've been through. But I really want to invite you back on a discussion to ask you what your thoughts of COVID-19 really is, and its origins and what's going on, because it's for another episode. But the media space and the public space is so cluttered at the moment that even my dad comes every 5 minutes with a new theory of who developed COVID, and I ask him, okay, so where's the proof? No, I saw a video and someone sent me a WhatsApp. And so I would like to, at some point, call you back on the show to discuss what do we filter out and what don't we, and because there are 5,000 stories, and I think people are going to die from stress before they die of COVID-19. And that's
exactly, and you know what I mean, the incidence of suicide is going to go up, and they're predicting in Australia that there are going to be more suicides than deaths from COVID-19, so it is very traumatic.
Of course.
The problem is that there's censorship. Already there's censorship, and you have to be very careful. So I think we should delay that for a few months, because otherwise, I've already been on one radio program which was censored, and they took the discussion offline. You can't find it anymore.
That's interesting.
Because I apparently was decided that what I said was half truths.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Half truths. So that's interesting, and it's interesting where the censorship is coming from. It'll all come out in the end. I think one thing is that medicine is going to be different. It's going to be in the future. It's going to be different. I don't think people are going to be so willing to accept what the medical profession says in the future. We couldn't control this COVID-19. And people are going to ask why, but you didn't protect us. Why not? And those are sorts of questions that are going to come out.
Of course. Professor, thank you for joining me on the show. I look forward to having you again one of the days very soon.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks, Faizal. Thanks so much, and good health to you.
Thank you, Professor Tim Noakes, and giving us his opinion. As usual, always very compelling. However, as usual, after Professor Noakes' show, I'm always expecting to get the backlash. Until next time, goodbye.